Great.
Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alison Cook to the Storybox, someone her work has inspired me. And I'm so grateful that she said yes to being on the show today. We're going to have so much fun, and I cannot wait to unbox more of her story. But for those of you that don't know who she is, she's a psychologist and writer who empowers women. And I'm sure, because I'm a man, I'll say she empowers me too from her work to heal from past wounds, develop a strong sense of self, forge healthy relationships with others, and experience a loving God who is for them. Her popular blog and podcast reach more than 50,000 people each week, which is incredible. She has her first book, which is called Boundaries for Your Soul. I like the title there. It's a faith-based adaptation of the fast-growing evidence-based internal family systems, IFS, which I'm curious to learn more about. And she has a brand new book coming out, which is pretty cool as well. The Best of You, Break Free from Painful Patterns, Mend Your Past, and Discover Your True Self in God. Great title once again. Alison, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I, for one, am really, really excited to have you here. Thank you for once again saying yes to being on my show. The very first question that I have for you before we journey into your backstory, why you do what you do, and all the good things is, what does success look like for you?
I love that question. For me, it looks like a life on the outside that flows from a deeply anchored place on the inside. So success to me, it may be wonderful things on the outside, but more importantly, it's when everything is flowing from a deeply anchored and rooted place on the inside.
Can you sort of describe that a little bit more for me? Like, what does that actually entail, like on a daily basis?
Yeah, I have a chapter in the last chapter of my book, The Best of You. I talked about living at peace with yourself and what that means. And I feel like that's been the journey of my life, is trying to figure out, how do I live at peace with myself? And what does that mean? Because it sounds like, you just walk around, and it's not that. Success, when I've tasted success, it feels like I am really connected to my true self. I am connected to the best of who I am, and simultaneously aware of the many different ways I can go off course, the different parts of me to get to the IFS stuff that can also kind of hijack me and take me off course, with compassion. And so it's this deep sense of awareness of the best of who I am, the best of who God is, man. And it comes from having examined the corners of my soul. And I know what's in there. God knows what's in there. The people that I trust know what's in there. And then I just get to have fun living, because I don't care what anybody else thinks. And some of that means, man, I get to write books. I get to do a podcast. But more importantly, it means I know why. I know what motivates me. I know what I'm good at. I know what's hard for me. I know what takes me off course. God knows. And a few trusted people know. And that's freedom. So to me, that's success, is freedom.
How did you realize all this, Alison? Was there sort of like a wake up moment, like catalyst, or was there sort of more like this gradual, over the course of your life, different points for you?
I realized that I had started to glimpses. I've been working at it for 25 years, as an adult, as a young adult, kind of without realizing it. So a lot of it comes in the rearview mirror, right? You go, oh, but about 2 years ago, I realized, I'm starting to taste freedom. And I didn't know. I knew I wanted it, but I didn't know what it would feel like or how I would get it. And it came after a medical crisis. And I talk about this in the opening in the introduction of my book. I had a stroke it's been almost 2 years, and I'm okay, thanks to the swift action of my husband and the doctors, but it scared me to death. Scared me a lot. It was a real trauma response that I had. And in that 6 months after that, I just had to I love your terminology, open the box even deeper, go even further in what really matters, and there was a moment. So it was, to answer your question, it was years of trying for something, but I didn't know how to get it. And there's a lot in that I can unpack for you, like different key moments, tons of different key moments. But the most recent key moment was after that. And I thought, oh my gosh, here I am sitting by myself before God with nothing, because I had to clear the deck. I had to stop work, close down my practice for a few months. I'm in the middle of nowhere because it's a pandemic. My family had relocated. And I had that moment. If all goes away, what matters? And I knew. And it was my freedom. And it was the freedom to know myself before God, and to know that I'm loved, and to know that's enough. And it sounds cliche, but I felt it at every fiber of my being. And it's something I've been pursuing for a really long time in different ways. But finally I caught that glimpse. And I'm not going to say I live there every single day, but more and more frequently, almost every day I can go, no, I know that home base now. I know how to get back there.
Thank you for sharing that. I like how you also brought up, it's not a cliche, but I often say, if we mention the word cliche, you know why it's a cliche in the first place is because it's true.
It's
so
true.
That is the important factor there. And I'm interested in, when you did go through your stroke, do you know what was there a lot of stress involved? Because my grandfather had a brainstem stroke and he had two of them actually. The second one ended up killing him. But what was do you know, was there a lot of build up towards, or just like a sudden thing for you?
No, and that's what was so scary. I'm healthy. I'm in my 40s. I have no risk factors. It was out of the blue. Wow. Which is why I classify it as a trauma, in the sense of not everything is a trauma, but it was so, like, I think when something happens that shouldn't happen, if you're in a car accident, it's scary and probably traumatic. And also you might understand what happened. Yeah. This was just out of the blue. All of a sudden I could not move the left side of my body, and there was no reason why. Still, the doctors don't exactly know why. And that illusion of control, right? That illusion of safety was just ripped out. I've always been really healthy, taken that for granted. So I didn't know. And that's what was, even though I walked out of the hospital after 3 days, for the most part, okay physically, because they stopped, they caught it in time. Yeah. The scary part was, that took me to God, was, whoa, like sometimes things happen that why we can't explain. And we know that as people of faith, we know that, but when you really have to go face to face with it, it takes it to a whole nother level.
Yeah, there's been many times like that for me, and ultimately I just think of it like God is trying to make us focus more on him a little bit more in trusting him. So if I was to sort of try and relate to your story a little bit, I haven't had a stroke, but I ended up getting meningitis, and I was blind during that time, and I had to learn how to trust the doctor that I couldn't see. And a big part of me in trusting someone is actually seeing them in their eyes. And he told me, like, he's about to do a lumbar puncture, and he goes, you have a 50% chance that the lumbar puncture will be successful. And the other part of it is you could potentially be paralyzed from the waist down, or in the worst case, die from it. You can hit the wrong spot and it could just, And so I was like wrestling with God the entire time. Like, why is this, number one, happening to me of all people? Yeah. And secondly, the voice just kept saying to me, do you trust me? Do you trust me? And I kept saying, well, of course I do. Of course I do. Why wouldn't I? But really I didn't. And that was the fighting point for me. So I understand, like, looking at, like, why is God doing this to me? Yeah. Like that, it's a tough question to sort of ask, like yourself, because a lot of people in the world today, and I wanted to ask you this question, Alison, from your own perspective, like, why is there suffering? Why is there so much pain that a lot of people experience? If there is a God, and I know there is, but for a lot of people that don't know that there is a God, why is there so much pain? Why do these things happen to good people?
I love what you're saying. I'm so sorry that happened to you. The question that kept coming to me is, what does God actually promise? So what am I trusting God for? That's a tough question when you really drill down on it scripturally, right? And just in our own, because it was like, I wanted God to give me a guarantee that this was never going to happen again. And it's like, God's just like, and so then it's like, well, what does, and this gets to your question about success and where I've landed on, what does God promise?
Yeah.
And I boil it down to, he promises the fruit of the Spirit, which is joy, love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and self-control, and a closeness with his Spirit brings all of that. And it's like, okay, God, that I can trust that. And that doesn't mean you don't let bad things happen, because you do. We see it. So, you can't explain the atrocities that happen to people, in different parts of the country, in our own neighborhood, in our own, these really hard things happen.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that God brings the fruit of his Spirit, and that's enough. That's enough. That is eventually where I was like, I sense that peace. That's what I meant by I have no guarantee here, not even my life, but I have your peace and I feel it. It's not abstract. Okay, I'm good. That's kind of how I wrestled with that, where that landed me is what does God actually promise us? Because there is a lot that he doesn't promise. He promises to not leave us alone. He promises to be with us. He promises to give us those fruit of the Spirit. But beyond that, boy, there's some tough things that happen. And I don't know how to explain that to people. And as a therapist, I'll put on my therapist hat. I don't want to say to someone who comes to me and says this awful thing has happened to me, to say, well, God, I want to say that's hard. I don't understand. I don't get it. I don't think we have to explain God. Yep. God's big enough. But I do know, here's what I'll say. I don't know why God lets these things. Why is God letting, Ukraine happen? Why does God let these, but I do know that he loves you, that he's with you, and that we're going to get through this together. It's that kind of thing. That's kind of where I go all the way down. And I think when we've experienced something like what you've experienced, what I've experienced, it comes from a deeper, it's like a deeper, more like we've faced it in the face. It's less of head knowledge. It comes, I call it whole body knowing.
Is there, because you're a psychologist, is there a place, or where is the place more or less for God when it does come down to psychology?
And by that, do you mean when there is an actual mental illness?
Yeah, like more the intersection of faith in regards to human psychology. Does God play an important role, or where does he play an important role? Because a lot of psychologists would say, oh no, we can't include God here. It's not good. It doesn't work.
Yep.
Yeah, can't include religion, that sort of thing.
It's one of my favorite questions, which is why I studied both. I studied a master's in counseling in seminary, but then I went on to get a PhD in both religion and psychology because of exactly what you're saying. It was like the psychology world is saying, no, God, it's all psychology. We have the answers. The faith world was saying no psychology back then. This was in the, in the 90s. It's changed a lot, but there's still a little bit of it. The faith world is like, nope, God, it's all God. No psychology, right? Which doesn't make sense to me either, because I'm like, well, we go to doctors. We understand that medicine, that God can work through medicine, that God can work through scientists to create cures, right? Sure, God is behind that, but he works through his people who go get trained and study and learn and, create cures. And so why wouldn't it be the same in psychology? And so that became my area of intersection, being raised in a faith community where I thought, well, I just need to pray for these answers. I just need to trust God more. And then I began to think, but, some people have anxiety more than others. Why is that? Does that mean they're a worse Christian? Does that mean they're a worse person of faith? No. There's so many factors. There's trauma. There's the brain. There's biochemistry. There's genetic predisposition. There's all these variables. God knows that. It doesn't bother God when or depression, there's so many variables. And so I set out on a quest to go, let's figure out all the things that we can know, can understand, and God's still part of it, right? So let's say I'm somebody, or you're somebody, or we know somebody that has a diagnosis. Maybe they have an anxiety disorder. We get to go, let's do everything that we can do as humans to figure out how to ameliorate the effects of that. And how does your faith come alongside of you in that? Because God doesn't shame you for that any more than God shames someone who has a stroke or has, right? There's no shame in it, right? So we take the shame out. This is something I struggle with. This is how I cope with it. And this is where my faith is part of that. And maybe God didn't heal me from it, but boy, does God meet me in it and love me in it and not shame me for it. And you know what I mean? That's a little bit of how my work, I'm always trying to peel back the onion of what do we, what can we control? What can't we control? How does God come into all of it? Mm-hmm. And I will say, as a faith-based therapist, when God is part of that process, because when we're connected to God, we're connected to so much more of the person God made us to be. So we have access to more resources. Doesn't mean it takes everything away.
Yeah. Where do you land on when Christians say, I don't need a therapist. I don't need any of those strategies. God is the only one for me. He can heal me of my depression. He can heal me of all those things. Where do you land on that kind of conversation?
I mean, I would say to someone, with compassion and, I'm curious, if you go to a doctor, if you break an arm, you probably would. And so I would just want someone with that kind of thinking to understand that the brain is susceptible to ailments just as the body is. It's no different. It's no different. We know, we can study now, we can see now. And so there's no stigma to being someone with a predisposition to depression any more than there's someone being with a predisposition to any ailment. And so therapists are a wonderful tool of healing that God has given us to help us. I don't think it takes the place of, our faith, but it's a mechanism by which we can learn how the brain works. And so I would just hope someone would be open, have curiosity, even if they don't get it, to be open with curiosity. Shame is really what hurts people. And so when we start saying things like, oh, I don't need therapy, God healed me, we don't want to shame other people. And that can be a shaming message. And there's so many people, I can tell you right now, who have desperately prayed for God to take away their depression, their anxiety, their bipolar disorder, their trauma, the residual effects of their trauma. And are we really wanting to send the message to those people that, well, you're just not a good enough, your faith just isn't strong enough? Would we say that to someone who suffered through a terrible illness? Yeah. It's a very shaming message. So we just want to be careful about that.
And it's not kind either.
No, it's not empathetic. It's not compassionate.
It's very damning, in my opinion. Yeah.
I agree.
So I wanted to go back a little bit before we go forward, because I don't think I finished off with your stroke story. I wanted to ask you about, how long did it take you to recover from that?
Physically, a matter of weeks. I have one residual effect of it, and it's very minor, in my left hand, that never went away. They just said, because when they break up the clot, this is why I love the brain, right? Because as a psychologist, my doctors were laughing at me. They're like, you ask more questions than most of our patients. And I was like, well, I'm not a neuropsychologist, but I do love the brain. And so I wanted to know which part of the brain was injured, right? So when they break up a clot in the brain, there's a brain injury. Now, for me, it was tiny enough. They got it fast enough that it's just a very, very, but that doesn't heal, right? And this is what's so fascinating for me is, even though I'm a psychologist, not a doctor, is I see that, but what happens is your brain is, we call it neuroplasticity, builds all these new neural pathways so that essentially I didn't even need physical therapy. Like I was fine. Many people with strokes, they can go get physical therapy. It's not that their brain, that injury heals. It's that the brain learns to build new pathways that allow them to do the thing again that they couldn't do because of the stroke. So for me, it was very quick and there was very little residual damage. The emotion, that's what's interesting about why God allowed that, right? It gave me this window into like what I love, which is how the brain can be so resilient. But for me, it was more mentally and emotionally. It took me months I was on what I would call a fight flight response, a trauma response, where my body was highly anxious, waking up at night. And it just took a while for my nervous system to learn to trust myself, the world, my body, and God again.
When we are talking about trauma patterns, because you mentioning patterns and you also mentioned shame a moment ago.
Yeah.
I think it's a perfect way to sort of segue into talking about breaking free from, I guess, shameful patterns as well as traumatic patterns.
Yeah.
And my first question for you, Alison, is how does the pattern actually develop when it comes to trauma and for shame?
It's a great question. So the way that I look at them, and I talk about this link in this next book that's coming out in the best of you is kind of a broad overview of these dynamics. My first book was sort of a very specific modality that treats these dynamics. So this one is actually a little bit more accessible. Trauma, any kind of trauma, especially childhood traumas, creates a nervous system response. We know this now, right? This is not an issue of just calm down. It's like, no, my nervous system is firing, like it's happening in my body. And if you imagine a child who is witnessing violence or experiencing violence, they don't know that. And so their nervous system learns to constantly be on cortisol, adrenaline, all those chemicals are coursing through to where as an adult that impacts them. And it's in the body. Now what happens though is shame. If in that moment when that thing occurred, no one comes alongside, not everything like that has to become a trauma. Someone comes alongside and says, this is what's happening. You're not crazy. This is normal. We can work you through a process. So for me, I had that. So it was a couple of months. But if that never happens, shame comes in. And I believe this is where the enemy, Kurt Thompson, one of my favorite psychiatrists. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. I highly recommend it. The Soul of Shame. He talks about shame as evil's vector, right? And shame comes in and says, there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong. You made this bad thing happen. You're the reason that you feel this way. And shame just loves to play upon that vulnerability of a wound. And so, if that wound doesn't get healed, and I liken it to, if you broke your arm as a child, no one ever took you to a doctor. You learn how to live with it, but as an adult, your arm doesn't work right. Let's say you finally go to a doctor. It's going to be a lot harder to heal that than if you'd gone when you were 8.
Yeah.
We can still do it, but it's been living in your body for a long time. Similar with these traumatic injuries that come through our emotional life. So to answer your question, I think that any kind of wound to the soul becomes a vulnerability where shame can get in and kind of magnify these self-shaming messages that there's something wrong with me, as opposed to and as therapists, we are trained to ask the question, something happened. And to your term, what happened to you? Tell me your story. Because I bet if we get to the root of your story, we're going to find out that something happened that wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
And that we need to heal the messages you're telling yourself around that story.
Thank you for sharing that explanation. It made a lot of sense to me. And I wanted to ask you, because a question that keeps coming up for me is, yes, we have the responsibility as humans to do our best to heal from trauma, because trauma sucks. It's horrible. But the main question that I'm curious about is, well, if we are a Christian, why doesn't God just, heal it for us? Like, why doesn't he just do it? Like we pray and ask him, remove this burden from my life, kind of like Paul does. I have an affliction. Why can't you remove it? And God's obvious. I'm probably answering my own question here. Maybe I'll just let you explain it.
Well, I'm laughing because in this book that's coming out, I go through the 11 questions that people tend to ask. And chapter 10 is, why doesn't God just fix everything? Which is basically what you're asking. Like why doesn't God just fix it? Like, why do we have to, and it's $1 million question. So that theologians and scholars and people like you and me have tried to answer for. So I'm not going to answer it in one, but I'll say where where I think I've landed on it is a couple of things. I don't know. So that's where I'll start with. I don't know. People a lot smarter than me have tried to answer this question forever. I think a couple of things, though. I think our God is relational, and I think the process of working out the details of our healing is sacred and holy, and not. It's a part of. I want to think about how to say this carefully. It's a part of the work of our life for forever, and it starts now. And I've been informed on my thinking by N.T. Wright, who is a theologian who talks a lot about, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He talks a lot about God, this idea of sozo or salvation. That sozo is also translated as healing. And then when it says that God came to save us, sometimes we think of that as God came to like, boom, save us, boom, into another life. And really, what if God came to heal us as we live in this broken world as a result of the fall, and it's a journey. And that journey of healing starts now. It's not a one-time thing after we die, or it starts now, but it is a journey because we still live in a broken world. And so it's this journey of constantly both being a part of God's healing balm in my own soul, but bringing more, as I do that, I bring more and more of that healing balm into this broken world. And how would I know how to do that if I hadn't gone through that process myself? How do I know how to connect with you in your pain if I haven't had the Lord meet me in my pain and lead me through a process of healing it? And somehow that is part of this journey we're all on together that leads us ultimately into healing that, is that redemptive healing. Hopefully that'll be for all time. But I do think that journey becomes beautiful. I don't wish the pain on anyone, and I don't think God does either. But I think by allowing the healing to become a process, we engage in this world that we live in more powerful ways in ourselves, in our relationships with others, and in bringing more and more of God's healing into the world around us.
When you're speaking of healing, especially God's healing for the world and our own lives as well, is it actually possible, if we do the work hard enough, all these things, is it possible to truly heal from past wounds and even some present ones?
I think so. I do. I think we can heal. I think the body is designed to heal. I think and by the body, I mean the whole, the mind, holistically, mind, heart, soul, body. We are designed to heal, to be whole, because we were made to bear the image of God. And while there is brokenness, while there will always be brokenness while we are here, we are also designed to heal. And I think that is the journey, capital T, capital J. That is the way of following Jesus, is to choose every single day to go on that healing journey. So it's a little bit of a yes, I think we can heal. And I think we see milestones. To get to your earlier question, I've seen healing in myself that I wouldn't have thought possible, mentally, emotional, spiritually. And I'm still a human and I'm still in process.
Yeah. I like
and
how
I've
you
seen it in my
mentioned-
clients. I see my clients heal grow, develop more emotional health, more spiritual health, more mental health. And there's always life's still going to come in,
I like how you mentioned the body is designed to heal, and you look at like a wound on the skin, for example.
That's right.
Like I look at the amount of mozzie bites that I have and like the scar that remains. It doesn't mean that the wound is still there. It means it's covered up. It's healed.
That's
you
right.
may have a scar there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's still painful. And that's
right.
what I equate to internal pain that I've healed as well. Like it doesn't affect me the same way it used to affect me.
It doesn't.
It's just like it doesn't trigger me the same way either. It's just like it's a beautiful process. But the main thing is for people, they've got to actually get there. They've got to do the work and make that choice, right?
We do. And that's the part that God doesn't necessarily just zap us with a wand. Sometimes God does, but more often in the work that I see as a therapist for 20 years, we have to be open to that process. We have to be open to the pain, and we have to be open to walking in the way of healing. Yeah. And then we start to notice, oh my goodness. It's almost like physical therapy. It's like, it's slow, tiny steps. And sometimes you get big breakthroughs, and it's amazing. But it's no different than with our physical body. We train our physical body. We partner, we participate in that process.
Yeah. I've looked at it. I'd much rather go through the pain than run from the pain. Either way, I'm going to end up in pain, but the better alternative is going through it, because on the other side is that peace and that freedom that you were mentioning before. But you just got to be willing to go through a little bit more pain and discover all those questions that a lot of people often are scared to ask themselves, like who they really are. Those are important things. I really believe so.
And I would add, because I think this is a whole different way of, it changes your whole life. We aren't designed to be alone in our pain. And as we go through pain and as we learn who the people are that honor our pain, that bear witness to it, and we realize, that magnifies healing. A therapist is great. It doesn't have to be a therapist. Our relationships change because those relationships are so rich then, because we do that for, and so then that's part of going through the pain is in a weird way. There's this old saying, shared joy is twice the joy, shared sorrow, half the sorrow. We still have the pain. We still have the sorrow, but we're with somebody in it, which is part of the healing. And it also lightens the pain. So it's a weird way how this all works together, because as we are willing to go through pain and invite people to join us in that, we actually not only heal ourselves, but we have richer relationships.
Mm. Yeah, it's powerful. Mm-hmm. When in your life, Alison, has been your most vulnerable moment?
Oh my goodness. That's a good question. I can think of a parade but probably the real answer is that moment when my husband threw me in the car and raced me to the ER, and I had lost control of the left side of my body. I'd never felt a terror like that. Mm. Just because I had no control. No. And I'd never had something like that before, like what you've had, So that was probably just the sheer vulnerability of the things parading through my mind of all the things we talk about, bargaining with God. God, you can't, all the ways that when we feel vulnerable. So that was probably, there's others, certainly many others.
How long ago did the stroke happen?
2 years, about 2 years. Almost exactly. Yeah. Wow. It'll be about 2 years as this next book comes out. So, and the vulnerability, our vulnerability, again, it brought up and that's why it was so, because it brought up, there was shame messages, kind of this, I talk about it in the introduction, but I had just kind of landed on this message that felt so important to me, which was the start of this book, which was this idea that we have to learn to partner with God in this. We can't just blindly trust, other people, that it's a process, it's a journey. And there was a lot of like, did God kind of smite me stuff going, there was a lot. And then even just shame from when I was a kid, where I felt vulnerable and I felt like I was alone, and I felt that maybe God didn't see me, that God didn't care, that I was invisible. Some of that stirred up. And these are all themes I write about. So it all got tested. It was like, it took me months to kind of get back on the horse of writing about these ideas again, because I had to test my own does what I believe work type of thing. Yeah.
What was the most challenging part for you in actually writing this book and, I guess, making it happen? Like, writing a book is no easy thing.
No. Yeah.
What was most challenging for you with this one?
That's a great question. I think the lofty answer is I really wanted, kind of where I started, I wanted to stay true. I wanted to write about what I didn't just know intellectually and academically and from my practice and psychologically, but also what I knew to be true in my own experience of life. So I didn't want to write about things and that's why that stroke, while it was so terrifying, also became my greatest teacher, because I immediately had to apply all the things that I tell my clients. I had to walk through that process myself. So it was both a challenge, but it was also, because every time when you're writing, this, you're working on one yourself, you're testing, the authenticity. You're testing, does this really work? It was important to me to say, does what I am suggesting here resonate with people who've come through terrible atrocities of all kinds, and people that are, maybe they've had a nice family. I had a nice family. Maybe they had a nice family, but there's just some minor little t traumas, the hard things. That for me was just a labor of wanting to make sure that I was constantly thinking through a lot of different lenses as I wrote. I liked it, but it was also exhausting.
Yeah, completely understand that.
Yeah.
I struggle with major imposter syndrome. Like, who am I?
Yeah.
I was 23 at the time when I started writing it. And then now I'm almost 26 when it's about to come out. And I'm just like, who am I? Like, have I really experienced enough to share?
Yeah.
But then God just said, share it anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful that I did.
And if you're wise enough to be asking that question, you're probably on the right track. People always say to me, how do I know if this is a little unrelated, but they'll say to me, people say, how do I know I'm not a narcissist? And I'm like, if you're really asking the question, honestly, and examining it, you're probably not, because the people who aren't asking that.
Yeah, they avoid the question altogether.
They avoid the question altogether.
Way, I can't be a narcissist. No,
that's right. That's
Reflection.
Right. That's right. I'm not an imposter. I know everything. This is perfect. That's probably good cue that you shouldn't be reading that person's book. Yeah.
Well, that's good to know.
I have all the answers.
I'm all knowing. And then all of a sudden, as I've learned, as God so often does, in failure you learn life's greatest lesson, humility.
Humility. That's right.
Oh my goodness. How many times have I been knocked down by God and just shown humility? It's the way.
And what I found is it goes hand in hand with confidence. It's that freedom. Because the more we have true humility before God and know what we don't know, the more we're really confident about what we do know. It's this weird paradox. It's like, okay, I know I don't know everything, but I know some things. And these are really important things. And it's freedom. It's freedom. Yeah.
Love the message of freedom, honestly. I've got two quick final questions for you, Alison, if that's okay with you. What do you love the most about yourself and your story?
Gosh, that's a good question. I I'm used to turning these questions on other people. It's I'm noticing it. I'm like, I have a really hard time when that spotlight comes. I'm like, wow, nobody ever asked me these questions. I ask these questions to other people. I love that. Thank you for that. Because that's a great question for clients. What do you like about yourself? It's such an important question. I love that you ask that. I like my honesty, and that willingness to own, maybe humility is the better word no, I'm going to revise that. You might have to edit that out. Because I want to give you an honest answer.
It's okay.
I think I do. I think what I like the most about myself is that honesty. I am, what you see is what you're going to get. And I've worked hard for that. I've lived parts of my life where I've tried to shape shift, where I've tried to camouflage. I've tried to people please. It's not to say that it's not still there, but I've worked really hard at it. And I'm proud of the fruit of that in a good way. I'm proud of the fruit of just that freedom that I'm just who I am. And that feels really good to me. And I like it about myself. Yeah. So
you're the best of you, authentically.
Learning. Yeah. And then what was the second part of it? I can't remember the second part of your question.
What you love the most about your story?
Oh. Most of my story, I think to get to where I am now, I felt like I had to do a lot of it in an unorthodox way. I didn't necessarily take the straightest line. There's a creativity in me. So I took a lot of tricks and turns, and I've learned to really like that about my story. At times I was like, man, why am I didn't hit marks. I got didn't hit marks at the same time other people were hitting marks. And I got married late, and then I took this detour here and I did this thing there. And at this point in my life, I'm like, I like that about my story. I like it that I didn't take necessarily the straightest path. There are a lot of bends and turns in my story that I'm really glad are there.
You didn't follow everyone else.
Yeah, I didn't. No.
Did your own thing. Yeah. Very much the same.
Yeah.
Very much the same. Yeah.
Yeah, good. I like that.
This is my all-time favorite question. I love asking all my guests at the very end. But before I ask it, where do you want people to connect with you, Alison, get your new book, all those wonderful things?
Yeah. The best place is probably my website, which is just dralisoncook.com. It's Alison with one L. That's my Instagram handle, Dr. Alison Cook. I have a free weekly newsletter I send out every Thursday. I have a podcast every Thursday, but all that's on my website. And that's where the new book, you find out all the information about the new book there as well.
Well, I'll make sure everyone knows where to find you for sure.
Thank you.
And like I said in the very beginning, your work is inspiring. So people go and check it out. Like I said just a moment ago, it's my all-time favorite question. It is a hypothetical one, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. I know, don't ask me how in the world they got it all. We'll call it magic for the sake of argument. But they've been able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life? Feel free to take as much time as you need.
Mm-hmm. That I reached the members of God's flock who are hurting the most, including the parts of myself. Something along those lines, that I somehow was able to reach those who need God's love the most and who are hurting the most with the message of his love, including the parts of myself that need that message the most.
That is a beautiful send-off message. Dr. Alison Cook, thank you so much for your time today, your wisdom and your advice. and for joining me today on the Storybox podcast. I really, really enjoyed it.
I did too. Thank you for having me.